Have you ever looked at someone born after 1996 and wondered why they seem so different? Not just in the music they listen to or the apps they use, but in the way they feel, the way they think, the way they move through the world. There is something happening beneath the surface that most people are too busy dismissing to actually understand. And if you have ever felt confused by Gen Z, or if you are Gen Z and you have spent your entire life feeling like the world was not built for the way your mind works, then what you're about to discover goes far deeper than generational stereotypes. The psychology of this generation was not chosen, it was shaped, layer by layer, by forces that were invisible while they were happening. And what those forces created is a psychological profile unlike anything that came before it. And the reason that matters, the reason it is worth slowing down for, is because understanding what is really going on inside this generation is not just about them. It's about what all of us, collectively, are becoming. When people talk about Gen Z, they tend to reach for the same handful of words: anxious, distracted, entitled, sensitive. They point at phone screens and shrug, as if an entire generation's inner life can be explained by a single piece of technology. But what is actually happening is far more nuanced than that. And it has a name rooted in decades of psychological research. It's called environmental psychological formation. The idea is simple. The environment a person develops inside doesn't just influence who they become. It fundamentally constructs the neural pathways, the emotional templates, and the coping mechanisms that will define how they experience reality for the rest of their lives. Gen Z grew up inside an environment that was, in almost every measurable way, unlike any environment a human generation had ever developed inside before. Saturated with information, algorithmically curated, economically unstable, socially performative, and emotionally overwhelming. You may be living with the results of that environment right now, either from the inside, feeling the weight of a world that seems impossible to keep up with, or from the outside, watching someone you love struggle in ways that do not match the explanations you were given. In this video, we are going to explore 7 defining psychological traits of Gen Z, not as criticisms and not as excuses, but as a genuine map of what was built inside a generation that grew up in conditions no previous psychology textbook had ever accounted for. We will look at where each trait comes from, why it shows up the way it does, and what it actually means when you see it in yourself or in someone around you. Make sure you stay until the end, because the 7th trait is the one most people completely misread, and getting it wrong creates some of the deepest misunderstandings between this generation and everyone watching from the outside. The first psychological trait that defines Gen Z is a chronic state of low-grade hypervigilance, a nervous system that is permanently on alert, not because something dangerous is happening right now, but because something always could be. This is not anxiety in the clinical sense that most people imagine when they hear the word. It's subtler, more ambient, more like a background hum that never fully turns off. To understand where it comes from, you have to understand what it means to develop your threat detection system inside a world where the news feed is always updating and the information is almost always alarming. The human brain is wired to monitor its environment for danger, and for most of human history, that environment had clear edges: a village, a community, a horizon.
Gen Z grew up with an environment that had no edges at all. By the time a child born in 2001 was 10 years old, their threat detection system was receiving inputs from every corner of the planet simultaneously, without pause. Climate collapse, school shootings, economic precarity, political chaos, pandemic, not as distant adult concerns, but as the daily texture of childhood. What the nervous system does when it is trained on an endless stream of threat is precisely what you would expect. It stops returning to baseline. It stays ready. And when a nervous system stays ready long enough, readiness stops feeling like a response to danger and starts feeling like a personality trait. You see this in the way Gen Z talks about exhaustion, not a tiredness that sleep fixes, but a bone-deep weariness that arrives even after rest, as though the body spent the night still working, still watching, still waiting for what comes next. The second trait follows directly from the first, and it is one that gets misread constantly by everyone outside the generation: an extraordinarily high sensitivity to perceived injustice. When older generations see Gen Z react strongly, sometimes explosively, to things that seem minor, the instinct is to call it oversensitivity, to point to participation trophies and helicopter parents and say that this is a generation that was never allowed to lose. But the psychological reality is almost the opposite. A nervous system that has been in a state of chronic low-grade hypervigilance becomes exquisitely attuned to patterns, to the early signals that something is wrong, that a rule is being bent unfairly, that someone is being treated as less than. What looks like overreaction from the outside is, neurologically speaking, a highly trained pattern recognition system doing exactly what it was trained to do. The sensitivity is real. The calibration is what is debatable. Think about a young woman in her first job who pushes back loudly when she is talked over in a meeting, not because she cannot handle being ignored, but because her entire developmental history taught her that being ignored by systems of power has consequences that nobody warned you about until it was too late. Her reaction looks disproportionate. Her history explains it completely. The third trait is something researchers have started calling identity fluidity, an unusually loose relationship to fixed categories of self. Gen Z is, statistically, the least likely generation to describe themselves using a single, stable label across time. They resist being pinned down not because they are indecisive or uncommitted, but because they grew up in an environment that made fixity feel dangerous. When the world you are developing inside is algorithmically curated to show you every possible version of every possible life, the natural psychological response is not to commit early and hard to one path. It is to remain open, to try things on, to resist the kind of permanence that the world kept demonstrating could be taken away at any moment. This trait shows up in how Gen Z approaches careers, relationships, gender, belief, and community, not with the instability of someone who cannot make up their mind, but with the careful adaptability of someone who learned very young that the landscape shifts without warning, and that the people most hurt by that shifting are the ones who had built their entire identity around a single fixed point.
The fourth trait is a deeply ambivalent relationship to authenticity, craving it absolutely, performing it constantly, and feeling chronically uncertain about where one ends and the other begins. This one is worth sitting with for a moment because it sounds contradictory. How can a generation that values authenticity above almost everything else also be the most performative generation in human history? The answer lies in what happens when you develop your social identity inside a platform architecture that converts your self-expression into a metric. On social media, authenticity itself becomes a style. You perform the self that performs authenticity, and over enough years, it becomes genuinely difficult to separate the performance from the person. What Gen Z experiences as a result is a kind of existential blur, a persistent uncertainty about what they actually think versus what they have learned to say they think, what they actually feel versus what the algorithm rewarded them for expressing. You see this in the emotional exhaustion many Gen Z people describe when they try to have real conversations, not because they are shallow, but because they have had to build a second layer over their emotional core, and they are not always sure how to get back underneath it. The fifth trait is what psychologists call compressed time perception, an experience of time that is quantitatively different from what previous generations report. Because Gen Z grew up inside a media environment that was constantly refreshing, constantly producing new content, constantly cycling through news cycles and trends and cultural moments at a speed that the human attention system was never designed to process, the subjective experience of time collapsed inward. A trend that lasts 3 months feels ancient. A cultural reference from 5 years ago feels like archaeology. This is not laziness or impatience. It is the predictable neurological output of a brain that was trained to extract maximum relevant information from a maximum number of inputs in a minimum amount of time. What it produces, practically, is a generation that finds slow things genuinely painful, not as a preference, but as a neurological reality, and that simultaneously experiences a deep and unspoken grief for a kind of depth and slowness they can feel the absence of, but were never actually given the conditions to develop. The fifth trait is perhaps the most misunderstood by the generations watching from outside, and it is this: a profound and genuine political and moral seriousness that coexists with what appears on the surface to be political nihilism. Gen Z is the generation most likely to say that the system is broken, and also most likely to show up for local causes, community organizing, and mutual aid. This looks paradoxical until you understand the psychology underneath it. When you grow up inside a media environment that demonstrates repeatedly and visibly that large systems fail people, that institutions lie, that leaders disappoint, that the structures built to protect everyone tend to protect some people more than others, the rational psychological response is not to abandon ethics, but to relocate them. Gen Z did not stop caring about justice. They stopped believing that justice could be reliably delivered by the institutions that claimed to carry it. What looks cynical is actually a kind of sophisticated disillusionment, painful, honest, and often accompanied by a local, personal, relational ethics that older generations rarely credit them with having. The seventh trait, the one that most people misread, is a radical and almost paradoxical capacity for hope. Not optimism, which is a cognitive prediction about how things will turn out.
Not positivity, which is a mood, but a structural hope, a willingness to continue caring and creating and connecting even when the evidence for doing so is genuinely thin. This is the trait that surprises people most because it seems incompatible with everything that came before it in this list. A generation that is chronically hypervigilant, sensitive to injustice, skeptical of institutions, uncertain about identity, exhausted by performance. How does that generation also produce the art it produces, the creativity it generates, the communities it builds in the margins of a world that has not made room for them? The psychological answer is that hope, in its most mature form, is not a belief that things will be fine. It is a decision to act as though meaning is possible, even without proof. Gen Z learned that lesson not from optimism, but from necessity, and what it produced in them is a kind of quiet, unspectacular, deeply resilient psychological architecture that most people who dismiss them never take the time to actually see. Now that you have seen these 7 traits, the hypervigilance, the sensitivity, the fluid identity, the ambivalence about authenticity, the compressed time, the relocated ethics, and the structural hope, take a moment to sit with what this actually means when you apply it to the people in your life or to yourself. Because understanding a psychology does not just give you a framework, it gives you a different way of being present with someone. If someone you love is Gen Z and you have been reading their behavior as fragile or dramatic or directionless, what you have seen here suggests a different possibility, That what looks like fragility is often a nervous system doing exactly what it learned to do in conditions that were genuinely hard, and that what looks like directionlessness is often a careful navigation of a landscape that really is more uncertain than any previous generation had to face. And if you are Gen Z yourself, what this map offers you is not an excuse, but a recognition, a way of understanding your own interior life, not as a malfunction, but as a coherent response to a genuinely unusual set of conditions. If something in this video struck you, share it with someone who you think would benefit from hearing it, or tag someone who has spent years trying to understand what is actually going on inside this generation. What we explored today is really just the beginning of a much deeper conversation, because the psychology of Gen Z does not exist in isolation. It exists in relationship to every other generation trying to make sense of a world that changed faster than anyone was prepared for. If you want to go further, there is a video on this channel that explores the psychology of people who feel chronically misunderstood, what creates that experience, why it persists, and what it actually takes to bridge the gap between how you see yourself and how others see you. It connects directly to everything we talked about today, and it might give you the next piece of the puzzle. You will find it linked on screen right now and in the description below. Thank you genuinely for spending this time here. It means something that you chose to go deep on this rather than scroll past it. If this video gave you a new way of seeing something you had been looking at for a long time, please hit the like button because it helps this kind of content reach the people who need it most. And I want to hear from you in the comments. Which of these 7 traits do you recognize most strongly, either in yourself or in someone you love? And what did understanding its psychological root change for you? Subscribe if you want more content that takes the inner life seriously, and if you want to be notified when the next video goes up, the bell icon is right there. Take care of yourself.